In early 2025, President Trump proposed trilateral talks with Russia and China about reducing nuclear arsenals, suggesting that military budgets could be cut in half. On the surface, this sounds like progress. 3 nuclear powers sitting down to discuss disarmament, potentially ending decades of standoff. But Charlie Munger, the late investor and student of human behavior, would have seen something else entirely. Not a peace process, not diplomatic triumph, but a perfect laboratory for studying why humans fail at cooperation when the stakes are highest. This isn't a story about politics. It's a story about incentives, psychology, and why the most rational-sounding agreements often contain the seeds of their own failure. The question isn't whether leaders want peace. The question is whether the systems they operate within allow them to achieve it. The logic of nuclear arms reduction appears self-evident. The United States and Russia possess arsenals capable of destroying the world many times over. China's nuclear stockpile is growing rapidly. Each nation spends hundreds of billions maintaining weapons they hope never to use. The economic waste is staggering. The existential risk is undeniable. So why not simply agree to reduce? The benefits seem obvious: lower costs, reduced accident risk, diminished threat of miscalculation. A trilateral agreement would create transparency, establish verification protocols, and signal to smaller nuclear states that the major powers take disarmament seriously. On paper, it's elegant. 3 rational actors recognizing mutual interest and acting accordingly. But Charlie Munger spent his career understanding why things that work on paper fail in reality. He would have asked a different question. What are the incentives actually at play here? Not the stated incentives in official communiques, but the real incentives driving decision makers. Because in Munger's framework, incentives aren't just important, they're everything. As he famously said, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." And when you examine the incentive structure of nuclear negotiations, you begin to see why peace agreements are so often illusions. Charlie Munger didn't think in terms of good guys and bad guys. He thought in terms of systems, incentives, and predictable human errors. His approach was simple: identify the psychological tendencies that cause people to make mistakes. Then look for those patterns in the real world. He called these tendencies standard causes of human misjudgment, and he cataloged dozens of them over his lifetime. Several are particularly relevant to understanding why nuclear peace is so difficult. First, the incentive superpower. Munger believed that incentives dominate everything else. People respond to the reward and punishment structures they face, often in ways they don't consciously recognize. If the incentive structure pulls in one direction, logic and good intentions are usually powerless to overcome it. Second, the sunk cost fallacy. Humans have difficulty ignoring past investments, even when those investments should be irrelevant to future decisions. We irrationally escalate commitment to failing courses of action because we've already invested so much. Third, the social proof and tribal bias. People define themselves by their groups. Leaders derive legitimacy from appearing strong within their own domestic political context. Concessions that look like weakness undermine that legitimacy, regardless of whether they're strategically sound. Fourth, the illusion of control. Humans consistently overestimate their ability to manage complex systems. This is especially dangerous with nuclear weapons, where the complexity exceeds human capacity for real-time decision-making. Fifth, first-order versus second-order thinking. Most people stop at immediate consequences. They don't trace effects through multiple steps. A peace treaty might reduce tensions in the short term but create new vulnerabilities or incentives for cheating that emerge later. Munger would have looked at nuclear negotiations through these lenses, not as a political question, but as a laboratory for observing how incentives and cognitive biases interact in high-stakes environments. And what he would have noticed is that every party to the negotiation faces fundamentally misaligned incentives, not because anyone is evil, but because the system itself is structured in a way that makes cooperation nearly impossible. Let's trace the incentives facing each actor. For the United States, the U.S. possesses by far the largest military budget, spending $895 billion in fiscal year 2025. Any reduction agreement creates domestic political risk. Defense contractors employ millions, military bases drive local economies, entire congressional districts depend on weapons production. A president proposing cuts faces immediate pushback from constituents whose jobs are on the line. Meanwhile, the benefits of disarmament, reduced existential risk, are abstract and distant. The political incentive is to appear tough, not conciliatory. But there's a deeper issue. The U.S. security umbrella extends to allies in Europe and Asia. Any perceived weakness in America's nuclear posture raises questions about commitment to these alliances. Allies begin hedging, considering their own nuclear programs. The second-order effect of appearing weak may be proliferation. For Russia, Russia's nuclear arsenal is its primary claim to great power status, and recent developments included testing of nuclear-powered weapon systems. Economically, Russia cannot compete with the West. Conventionally, its military has been strained. But nuclear weapons make Russia a player that cannot be ignored. Any reduction diminishes this status. Moreover, Russia faces a fundamental trust problem. After decades of adversarial relations, Russian leaders have little reason to believe Western promises. The incentive is to maintain maximum deterrence, not risk vulnerability through cooperation. Russian leadership also faces domestic incentives. Projecting strength is essential for political survival. Concessions can be portrayed by opponents as capitulation. The personal cost to leaders of appearing weak may be regime instability. For China explicitly rejected participation in trilateral talks, stating it maintains its nuclear forces at the minimum level required for national security and does not engage in arms races. This isn't just posturing. China's nuclear arsenal is significantly smaller than those of the US and Russia. From Beijing's perspective, the request to negotiate is asking them to accept permanent inferiority. China's strategic calculus is straightforward. Why lock in a disadvantage? The incentive is to continue building until parity is achieved, then negotiate from strength. Agreeing to constraints now would be strategically foolish. There's also a historical dimension. China's national narrative centers on overcoming a century of humiliation when Western powers imposed unequal treaties. Accepting limits while behind in capability would echo that humiliation. Notice what's happening here. All three actors are behaving rationally given their incentive structures. No one is irrational or deliberately warmongering. But the system produces an outcome where cooperation is nearly impossible, not because anyone wants conflict, but because the incentives pull in opposite directions. This is what Munger meant by the incentive superpower. You don't need to understand what people believe or what they say they want. You just need to understand what they're rewarded for. And in this case, all three powers are rewarded for maintaining or expanding their nuclear capabilities, not reducing them. Even if negotiations begin, deeper psychological forces work against success. Consider the sunk cost fallacy. The United States and Russia have invested decades and trillions of dollars in nuclear infrastructure. Entire institutions, military commands, research laboratories, manufacturing facilities exist to maintain these weapons. Dismantling this infrastructure isn't just an economic question, it's an identity question. Thousands of people have spent careers working on nuclear weapons. Their expertise, their professional identity, their sense of purpose, all tied to maintaining deterrence. Asking them to walk away from this investment is asking them to declare their life's work was unnecessary. Organizations don't make these kinds of decisions easily. The institutional inertia alone is overwhelming. Then there's the ego trap. National leaders derive legitimacy from projecting strength. In democracies, appearing weak invites electoral defeat. In autocracies, it invites removal or worse. China has repeatedly stated that the US and Russia should make drastic cuts first before others join disarmament efforts. This isn't just strategic positioning. It's about avoiding the appearance of submission. No leader wants to be the one who gave away national security. Munger understood that ego isn't just vanity. It's a survival mechanism for leaders. The personal cost of appearing weak often outweighs the collective benefit of cooperation. This creates a fundamental misalignment between individual incentives and collective welfare. There's also the problem of tribal identity. Nuclear weapons aren't just military tools, they're symbols. They represent national prowess, technological achievement, the ability to stand as equals on the world stage. Citizens identify with these symbols. Reducing nuclear arsenals can feel like diminishing national greatness. Politicians who propose cuts risk being labeled as weak or naive. The domestic political incentive is to be the hawk, not the dove. And then there's the illusion of control. Nuclear command and control systems are staggeringly complex. Launch procedures involve multiple redundancies, split-second decisions, incomplete information, and the potential for catastrophic error. Yet humans consistently overestimate their ability to manage this complexity. We believe we can control nuclear weapons, maintain them safely, never use them accidentally, deter adversaries without triggering escalation. This illusion of control makes the status quo feel safer than it is. We discount the risk of accident or miscalculation because we believe we're competent enough to prevent it. This makes change feel more dangerous than inaction, even when inaction carries enormous risk. Even if a peace agreement were signed, the second-order effects would create new problems. Imagine the US, Russia, and China agree to reduce their arsenals by 50%. On the surface, this is progress. But consider what happens next. Russia has indicated it would insist that the nuclear arsenals of France and the United Kingdom be included in future negotiations. A reduction by the major powers doesn't eliminate nuclear weapons. It changes the relative balance. suddenly smaller nuclear states become more significant. France and the UK, previously minor players, gain relative importance. These nations face a choice: accept constraints or maintain their arsenals and gain relative advantage. The incentive is obvious. Any major power reduction creates pressure for middle powers to maintain or expand it. This is the proliferation paradox. Reductions at the top can incentivize maintenance or growth at lower levels. There's also the cheating problem. Nuclear treaties require verification, but verification is never perfect. The New START Treaty provided legal requirements for monitoring compliance, but monitoring has limits. Underground facilities, mobile launchers, dual-use technology all create opportunities for hidden programs. The incentive to cheat is powerful. If you comply and your adversary cheats, you end up disadvantaged. If you both comply, you maintain parity but lose the arsenals you invested in. But if you cheat while your adversary complies, you gain advantage. Game theory calls this a prisoner's dilemma. The rational individual choice, cheat, produces the worst collective outcome. But rationality at the individual level leads to irrationality at the system level. Munger would have recognized this immediately. He spent decades studying situations where individual rationality produces collective failure. Nuclear negotiations are a textbook example. There's another second-order effect: the signal sent to non-nuclear states. Many countries have the technical capability to build nuclear weapons but have chosen not to. This restraint depends partly on security guarantees from nuclear powers. And if the major powers appear to be stepping back from their nuclear commitments, or if their arsenals are reduced to the point where extended deterrence seems less credible, these non-nuclear states may reconsider. Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Germany all have the capability and, under certain conditions, might have the motive. A peace agreement meant to reduce nuclear danger could inadvertently increase proliferation pressure. The second-order effects work against the first-order intentions. Here's what Munger would have found most interesting. Everyone involved genuinely believes they're being reasonable. American officials believe they're proposing sensible arms control. Russian officials believe they're defending legitimate security interests. Chinese officials believe they're rejecting an unfair bargain. All three are correct from their own perspective. This is the deepest insight from Munger's framework. The problem isn't that anyone is wrong. The problem is that the incentive structure makes cooperation nearly impossible, regardless of good intentions. Munger would have noticed the pattern he saw throughout his career: systems designed with the best intentions that produce outcomes nobody wants. Not because people are malicious, but because the incentives embedded in the system push behavior in predictable directions. He would have noted the sunk costs, the decades of investment that make change psychologically painful. He would have identified the ego incentives, leaders who face personal consequences for appearing weak. He would have spotted the tribal dynamics, nations that define themselves partly through military capability. And he would have recognized the illusion of control, the belief that complex systems can be managed when in reality they're barely contained. Most importantly, Munger would have understood that this isn't about politics. It's about human nature operating within particular constraints. Change the constraints, change the incentive structure, and behavior changes. But as long as the incentive structure remains, behavior will remain predictable. The tragedy is that everyone can see the collective benefit of disarmament. The economic waste is obvious, the existential risk is undeniable. But seeing the benefit doesn't mean being able to achieve it, because the incentives facing individual actors pull in opposite directions. This is the core of Munger's wisdom: understanding the difference between what should happen and what will happen. What should happen is rational cooperation. What will happen is determined by incentives. So we return to the paradox at the beginning: a peace agreement that looks like progress but contains the seeds of its own failure. Not because anyone is evil, not because anyone wants conflict, but because the system itself is structured in a way that makes sustainable cooperation nearly impossible. The headlines about nuclear negotiations will come and go. Leaders will make proposals, issue statements, hold summits. Some agreements may even be signed. But Munger would have understood that the real question isn't whether an agreement is reached. It's whether the incentive structure supports compliance over time. And on that measure, history isn't encouraging. Russia withdrew from the last remaining arms control agreement in 2023. Treaties are made and broken. Verification regimes are established and undermined. Each side accuses the other of bad faith, and each side is partly right. This doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It means we should be realistic about what's possible within current constraints. The illusion isn't that peace is impossible. The illusion is that we can achieve it without fundamentally changing the incentive structures that drive behavior. Munger spent his life studying incentives because he understood they're more powerful than reason, more persistent than good intentions, more predictive than stated goals. If you want to understand how systems behave, don't listen to what people say. Look at what they're rewarded for. In nuclear negotiations, all parties are rewarded for maintaining strength, punished for showing weakness, and face enormous sunk costs in existing infrastructure. The system itself works against cooperation. This isn't pessimism, it's realism. And realism is the first step towards seeing the problem clearly enough to potentially solve it. The question isn't whether leaders are wise enough to pursue peace. The question is whether we can design systems where pursuing peace aligns with individual incentives rather than working against them. Until we do, nuclear negotiations will remain what they've always been: theatrical gestures that sound promising, generate headlines, and ultimately founder on the rocks of misaligned incentives. Charlie Munger understood this, not because he was cynical, but because he was clear-eyed. He saw systems as they are, not as we wish them to be. And what he would have seen in nuclear negotiations is the same pattern he saw throughout markets, institutions, and human affairs. Incentives matter more than anything else. The weapons aren't the problem. Human nature operating within particular constraints is the problem. And until we change those constraints, really change them, fundamentally restructure the incentives facing decision-makers, we'll continue to see peace agreements that look like progress but function as illusions. That's not political commentary. That's just how systems work. And Charlie Munger was very, very good at understanding how systems work.